Welcome to Around the Weird. Here's your host, the museum curator of the strange and unusual, Mr. Nothing.
Thank you, mysterious voice, and welcome back to Around the Weird, a booktube channel where I talk about all the unusual and out of the ordinary literature that I have found in my travels. Today it is Poetry Thursday, a great day to talk about all the fun poetry that exists in the world. So today I wanted to focus on a spooky poem. Some might consider it a classic poem, at least a classic American poem. I am referring to one about a bird tormenting a man. I will be reading The Raven by Edgar Allan Poe. For those who don't know, and I talked about Poe on Tuesday, so if you're a regular watcher of my channel, you might know who he is. For those who are newer and don't know about Poe, which I think it'd be surprisingly few people who didn't actually know about Poe. But again, he was a writer in the 1800s. He wrote a lot of dark, gothy, spooky poetry. He was a very sad man who experienced a lot of death in his life, and that influenced his writing. And he's known for writing the Raven, as well as just one book, the narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym of Nantucket, which I reviewed last year as part of my booktube challenge from Lucas over at the Bits of Lit. I won that challenge, but he refused to acknowledge my victory. So he's such a villain there. But anyways, yeah. So Poe has written a lot, and we're all grateful for it. And so, really, without further ado, let's talk about this poem, which some argue is a classic. I would argue is a classic. I'm pretty sure, if you were in American high schools, you probably have already read it to some degree, because I recall in my high school, it was taught in my American literature class. And so I have a feeling that, most people already know the poem. But let's talk about it and analyze it a little bit. I'll read it, and then I'll do a brief analysis, and we will move on from there. The Raven by Edgar Allan Poe. Once upon a midnight dreary, while I pondered, weak and weary, over many a quaint and curious volume of forgotten lore, while I nodded, nearly napping, suddenly there came a tapping, as of some one gently rapping at my chamber door. "'Tis some visitor," I muttered, tapping at my chamber door. Only this, and nothing more. Ah, distinctly I remember it was in the bleak December, and each separate dying ember wrought its ghost upon the floor. Eagerly I wished the morrow, vainly I had sought to borrow from my books surcease of sorrow for the lost Lenore. For the rare and radiant maiden whom the angels named Lenore, nameless here forevermore. And the silken, sad, uncertain rustling of each purple curtain filled me with fantastic terrors never felt before, so that now, to still the beating of my heart, I stood repeating, "'Tis some visitor entreating entrance at my chamber door, some late visitor entreating entrance at my chamber door, that it is, and nothing more." Presently my soul grew stronger, hesitating then no longer. "Sir," said I, "or madam, truly your forgiveness I implore. But the fact is I was napping, and so gently you came rapping, and so faintly you came tapping at my chamber door, that I scarce was sure I heard you. Here I opened wide the door, darkness there, and nothing more." Deep into that darkness peering, long I stood there wondering, fearing, doubting, dreaming dreams no mortal ever dared to dream before. But the silence was unbroken, and the stillness gave no token, and the only word there spoken was the whispered word, "Lenore." This I whispered, and an echo murmured back the word, "Lenore." Merely this, and nothing more. Back into the chamber turning, all my soul within me burning, soon again I heard a tapping somewhat louder than before. "Surely," said I, "surely that is something my window lattice. Let me see then where that is, and this mystery explore. Let my heart be still a moment, and this mystery explore. 'Tis the wind and nothing more." Open here I flung the shutter, when with many a flirt and flutter, in there stepped a stately raven of the saintly days of yore. Not the least obeisance made he, not a minute dropped or stayed he, but with mine of lord or lady perched above my chamber door, perched above a bust, a palace just above my chamber door, perched and sat and nothing more. Then this ebony bird, beguiling my sad fancy into smiling, by the grave and stern decorum of the countenance it wore, though thy crest be shorn and shaven, thou, I said, art sure no craven, ghastly, grim, and ancient raven, wandering from the nightly shore. Tell me what thy lordly name is on the night's Plutonian shore. Quoth the raven, Nevermore. Much I marvelled this ungainly fowl to hear discourse so plainly, though its answer little meaning, little relevancy bore, for we cannot help agreeing that no living human being ever yet was blessed with seeing bird above his chamber door, bird or beast upon the sculptured bust above his chamber door, with such name as Nevermore. But the raven sitting lonely on the placid bust spoke only that one word, as if his soul in that one word he did outpour. Nothing farther than he uttered, not a feather than he fluttered, till I scarcely more than muttered, other friends have flown before. On the morrow he will leave me, as my hopes have flown before. Then the bird said, Nevermore. Startled as the stillness broken by reply so aptly spoken, doubtless said I, where it utters its only stock and store, caught from some unhappy master whom unmerciful disaster followed fast and followed faster, till his songs one burden bore, till the dirges of his hope and melancholy burden bore of nevermore. But the raven still beguiling all my fancy into smiling, straight I wheeled a cushioned seat in front of bird and bust and door, then upon the velvet sinking, I betook myself to linking fancy unto fancy, thinking what this ominous bird of yore, what his grim, ungainly, ghastly, gaunt, and ominous bird of yore meant in croaking, Nevermore. This I sat engaged in guessing, but no syllable expressing, to the fowl whose fiery eyes now burned into my bosom's core. This and more I sat divining, with my head at ease reclining, on the cushion's velvet lining, with the lamplight gloated o'er, but whose velvet violet lining, with the lamplight gloating o'er, she shall press, nevermore. Then methought the air grew denser, perfumed from an unseen censer, swung by seraphim whose footfalls tinkled on the tufted floor. Wretch, I cried, thy God hath lent thee by these angels he had sent respite, and nepenthe from these memories of Lenore. Quaff, oh quaff this kind nepenthe, and forget this lost Lenore. Quoth the raven, Nevermore. Prophet, said I, thing of evil, prophet still, if bird or devil, whether tempter sent or whether tempest tossed, thee here ashore, desolate yet all undaunted, on this desert land enchanted, on this home by horror haunted, tell me truly, I implore, is there balm in Gilead? Tell me, I implore. Quoth the raven, Nevermore. Prophet, said I, thing of evil, prophet still, if bird or devil, by that heaven that bends above us, by that God we both adore, tell this soul with sorrow laden, if within the distant Aden it shall clasp a saint and maiden whom the angels name Lenore, clasp a rare and radiant maiden whose the angels named Lenore. Quoth the raven, Nevermore. Be that word our sign of parting, bird or fiend, I shrieked upstarting. Get thee back into the tempest in the night's Plutonian shore. Leave no black plume as token of that lie thy soul hath spoken. Leave my loneliness unbroken. Quit the bust above my door. Take thy beak from my heart, and take thy form from off my door. Quoth the raven, Nevermore. And the raven, never flitting, still is sitting, on the pallid bust of Pallas just above my chamber door, and his eyes have all the seeming of a demon's that is dreaming, and that lamplight o'er him streaming throws his shadow on the floor, and my soul from out that shadow that lies floating on the floor shall be lifted nevermore. And so that was The Raven by Edgar Allan Poe. a pretty wonderful poem. Again, some have speculated or argued that it is one of the best poems ever written, and I'm kind of leaning there. I kind of believe that this is such a great poem in terms of the rhyme scheme, in terms of the content of the poem, in terms of what Poe is trying to say. I think it's a pretty amazing poem, and one of the best ever written. It's pretty easy to see what Poe is talking about in this poem. A man opens up his window, a bird flies in and says Lenore, or says Lenore outside his window. So like he's like, bird, tell me your secrets. My lovely Lenore just died. I gotta know more. And the bird just says nevermore. And so he's like, what does this mean? Like, does this mean there's no heaven? Does this mean I won't get to meet Lenore in the future? And the bird just like nevermore. That's all it's saying. And like Poe is just like, or like not Poe, but the narrator's just like that can't be true. The narrator can't believe that this bird is telling him that he won't get what he wants in the future. After his death, he won't be reunited with his lost Lenore in eternity, and it kind of drives him mad by the end of the poem. And that's mainly what the poem is about. It's about grieving over the death of a loved one, and how we're willing to pretty much do anything to get a piece of them back. So in this case, the narrator is anthropomorphizing a bird, like one that can't speak English, but he thinks it can. Like in some way, maybe the bird like can speak English for some reason. He's choosing to believe that, maybe because he's desperate and in a time of grieving. And I didn't mean to make another poem about death, but here we are again. So we're talking about death again. But yeah, that's what death does. Like when you grieve over someone and you want to be with them for just a little bit longer, like you look for signs that may not actually be there. Like it's clear that this bird is just repeating lines they probably heard in the past. The narrator even notes it himself, but to some degree, he doesn't want to truly believe that, because if it's just random, then maybe there's no heaven after all. Like maybe he wants to believe that this is some bird sent by the angels to ease his suffering, but that's probably not the case, and it's really hard to deal with that. And so he just keeps getting angrier and angrier, and that that's like it, because one, the bird is not only challenging his sadness, like it's challenging his grief that Lenore is no longer going to be here, but it's also maybe challenging his belief in the afterlife. And the bird's not actually challenging anything. Again, like he's forcing that upon the bird and as a way of possibly dealing with his grief, or like trying to ease his own suffering. But it's clearly not working as it turns out by the poem, because he just slowly grows madder. And again, this is something that I have to wonder about Edgar Allan Poe, because like I feel like he felt many of these emotions before. He writes about death so frequently, and he experienced quite a bit of death in his time, that I do have to wonder if this poem maybe explains some of the feelings he had, and if he tried to accidentally anthropomorphize an animal in order to make sense of these deaths. But I don't know for sure, so we'll just have to leave it at that. But this is a pretty wonderful poem, and I especially like the rhyme scheme and the use of the word nevermore. As each time you read it, it's sort of like it makes sense to read it with emphasis more and more each time, because it's just like nevermore, and then by the end you're like nevermore, because in the narrator's mind, like it's getting more and more serious each time the bird says nevermore. Like it's taunting him more and more, even though it's very clear that the bird is not doing that. Like you can interpret this multiple ways. Like you could interpret this as all being a dream, because the narrator did say he was napping. So it's entirely possible like this could be like in his head the entire time, sort of being taunted by his own dreams, which would make sense. But I feel like you could interpret this in any way you want, and as long as you can, support it in the text, like yeah, there's a lot of things that the text can support. So I think that's one of the reasons why I like it, and one of the reasons why so many other people really, really, really like it. Anyway, those are my thoughts on The Raven, as well as a reading of The Raven by Edgar Allan Poe. It's a pretty good poem. I'm going to put it in the description so that you can find it and you can read it yourself. I do think it's worth checking out, especially if you haven't read it already, and maybe that might have to do more with age than anything else. But I'm fairly certain they're still teaching this in American high schools. If you read this poem before, or you simply want to comment on something I said here today, feel free to do so below. I would love to hear from you. Also, I want to give a shout out to Bevan, because she is the one who suggested I read this poem. She doesn't have a booktube channel yet, but when she makes one, I'll make sure to start, recommending that you go check out her work, because I really like to hear her thoughts, and I'm sure you'll like to hear some of her thoughts on books too. Otherwise, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so that more people can find out about Poe, and more people can find out about Poetry Thursday. See what I did there? Yeah, Poetry Thursday is fun, so let's spread it around. And until then, I wish you the best of luck in your weird and birdie travels. Farewell.